Well, good afternoon. John Chapman here. I'm always pleased to come to Himley Hall because you get such an amazing, as you can see behind me, an amazing building. Now, I'm not a Churchill fanatic. I'd either hate him or love him, but I can see the good and the bad with Winston Churchill. He had an awful lot of bad points, and he was the first to understand that. He had what he called his black dog, which was a severe depression about the fact that he had and made an awful lot of mistakes in his life. But he used to forget some of the good things he did, and in fact when he was Home Secretary and involved with the Treasury, he did cut our Navy right down. At the time the Navy hated him for it, but to be fair, it allowed them to rebuild again and to get away from an empire which we didn't have anymore and rebuild the Navy. So there was lots of good things came out of it. Winston Churchill goes back to 1874 when he was born, and of course he had, as a very young lad, a very sad upbringing. From the age of 4, his father was involved with Ireland. He was the secretary to the Irish Premier, technically, as what we didn't call it that at the time, and Churchill was over there as a 4-year-old, and he went to a boarding school. He didn't want to go to a boarding school, and he was at a boarding school to a very young age. Then he came back to a normal school for a short period and then ended up in Harrow. Now, Harrow was where he did his main schooling, but also it was at that time that he let it be known that he, as a teenager, that the only time he was ever close to his father was what he could count on one hand. And in fact, it was only 4 times in one of his books that he wrote. And bear in mind, Churchill wrote 20 or more books, and one of which before he was 25. In fact, he almost wrote his first book very similar to Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's first book was on Churchill. He very sadly wasn't close to his father, and therefore there was an awful lot of problems there. But when he went to Harrow School, the head of year talked about and was interviewed before Churchill passed away after the war. He was interviewed about this young chap he had, and he said he was the second most stupidest boy in the school. And when the interviewer asked who the most stupidest boy was, he said, well, of course, it was his brother. So it was Churchill's brother, who were both at school together in Harrow. And that's only because Churchill refused to learn Latin. He said, it's a waste of time, this language is. It's no good at all. Well, of course, we all know Latin is Latin, and whether you like it or not, it's the start of all languages, and therefore it's the basis of all. But Churchill wouldn't have it and wouldn't learn it, and therefore he was the second most stupidest boy in Harrow School. He wasn't very good at maths. He wasn't very good at many subjects. He was exceptionally good at English. And of course, that was where, when he left school and joined the military, he actually couldn't survive with the £300 a year that he was earning. So his mother subsidised him to a certain amount of money, and he was able then to survive all bar £100 a year. Now we've got to convert that to about 10,000 this year. So he wasn't able to survive on about 60,000 a year back in just before World War One, in the Boer War, in fact, which is where he first joined the military. So he decided then that he needed to become a journalist, which he did, and he actually started writing at a very early age, and his first book was on Kitchener's main war through the Boer War, and Kitchener wasn't particularly happy with Churchill because he didn't like what Churchill put down in words, which was basically criticising a lot of what Kitchener did. And like Kitchener, Churchill was good and bad, and Kitchener was also exceptionally good but also particularly bad because it was building on the power of Britain as it wasn't anymore. Churchill joined the Light Infantry and led one of the last cavalry charges. His cavalry stable master was not happy the first time he met him. Churchill went in and said, what's that silly man doing? Why is he doing that particular job? And the stable master said, sir, I'm in charge of this stable, not you. You may be an officer, but you really don't know what you're talking about. That wasn't quite the words he used, but it basically summed him up. And then Churchill, when he came back the second time, suggested that maybe he could help by helping in the stable yard, and again the stable master said, no sir, you're an officer, you don't do menial tasks, I don't do menial tasks, I tell people what to do from that. So he started off the wrong foot, but the stable master also said that Winston Churchill as a young soldier was quite good with his men. He knew the history of all his men, where school they went to, where they worked for, where they came from, what their aspirations were and where they were going in life. And that was really important from that. And the stable master from then really had a great deal of respect for Winston Churchill. He was captured in the Boer War. It was quite a shame. He was actually on a train when the Boers actually barricaded the beginning of the train, so it couldn't go any further. The train was then attacked, and of course they then broke the lines up the back, so the train couldn't reverse. Churchill was the only person there that jumped in charge and took control, and of course the Boers then realised who they'd got. They'd got Winston Churchill, and of course because of his father and his own upbringing was a famous catch. Fortunately, Churchill, with the help of some of the locals, escaped. They had a £25,000 reward out on his head, which would be the equivalent of the value nowadays. But Churchill managed to get through it and get round it and get back and escape. So that was quite something. When World War I, Winston Churchill was at the Battle of Ypres. This was one of the most famous battles. Unfortunately, he only really lasted until about 6 months, and it was the government decided to pull him out because he was a risk factor, and of course if anything had happened to him it would have been a coup for the Germans. So Churchill was pulled back and then moved into politics, but not before the Scots battalion of the Royal Scots Guards said that he was their best battalion commander they ever had, mainly because he looked after his men. And of course officers very rarely looked after the men, they looked after themselves. It was the senior NCOs, the non-commissioned officers as we used to call ourselves, would look after the men. But in his case he was one of the real top knobs from that point of view. Chartwell to this day is a museum to Winston Churchill, and if you go back there now and walk into Chartwell, you go back in time. His wife Clementine was quite a character, quite a coup. He loved her to bits, although there was lots of rumours that he would play around with other ladies. He used to tease them, and he was a bit of a tease, so he was seen as a ladies' man, but really most of it was all talk and no do. In fact, there was one particular lady, Lady Astor, who said, "Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I'd poison you." He said, "Madam, if I was married to you, I'd drink it." KBO was what Churchill used to say after every telephone conversation, and his secretary used to write it down because she had to write down every telephone conversation he had and produce it in minutes, which she did. And the senior secretary said to her, "Why do you keep writing down KBO?" "Well, after every telephone conversation he always says KBO." That was his way of signing off. And so the senior secretary, the gentleman, said to the young lady, "Do you know what that means?" She said, "No." He said, "Keep buggering on." It was Churchill's way of signing off, and he just said, "Keep buggering on." But maybe it's not a story I should tell. When he retired, he'd been painting, and at the end of the war, one of his compadres said in the house, "Why are you painting?" And he said, "Well, it's either that or write books on war, and I think I prefer painting." He retired as a painter. He also used to keep butterflies. People had no idea that Churchill bred butterflies until he felt that it was cruel to keep butterflies because of their short life, and he decided that he would just let them go and never kept butterflies again. From butterflies he went to bricklaying, and Winston Churchill became a master bricklayer. And in Chartwell now, when you walk around, you see some of the areas that he actually laid bricks. And the Guild of Master Craftsmen came, as it was then, and it was a Master Craftsman Guild, came and checked his brickwork and allowed him to become a member of the Guild of Master Craftsmen because his bricklaying was quite good. His daughter worked with him and told many, many stories. Sadly, she's passed away in the last few years, but his granddaughter, who has those stories, repeats them now. They've just opened a new hotel called Churchill in Camera de Lobos in Madeira, and Winston Churchill is famous for going to Madeira and turning Madeira's fortunes. When he went there, Madeira was not a place to go for holidays, but then people wouldn't think of it as a holiday resort. When Churchill came away from Madeira, and he was only there for 12 days, he went for a few months, but Attlee, while he was away, decided to call a general election, and Churchill left his wife Clementine there and came back. And ever since then, Madeira has grown and grown and grown, and they love Winston Churchill to bits. In fact, there's a statue of him actually painting in Camera de Lobos, and they've now opened up a new hotel in Camera de Lobos celebrating Churchill. One of the pictures you'll see here is Churchill waving at age 65 as he came back into power. And of course, when most of us at 65 years of age retire, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister for the first time in 1940. And you'll see in the picture him waving from there. The Navy never really forgave Churchill for cutting them back, but they still had a great admiration for him. And when he became head of the War Office and head of the Government War Department, as well as being Prime Minister, which meant he's in charge of the War Cabinet, the Navy sent a signal round, Winston is back. Every ship sent that signal around the world to confirm that Winston was back. They couldn't just link onto a computer like we can nowadays and know within seconds, but the Navy got it round within minutes to every naval ship. Winston Churchill knew he hadn't got long to live and decided that he would plan his own funeral. He did write down what he was going to have, and one of his assistants said, well, you can't. The Queen has decided you will actually have a state funeral. Okay, he said, but I'm not having that bloke de Gaulle come to my funeral. He said, sir, you can't do anything about it. De Gaulle is head of the French people and he has to come to the funeral. Right, he said, well then my funeral cortege, which is going to Bladen, will leave from Waterloo. I will get one back on de Gaulle if it's the last thing I do. And he had his way. The train had to change directions 3 times to go to Bladen from Waterloo. If it had left one of the other stations, it could have gone straight there, but Churchill got his way. And there's a wonderful video that we show when we give our talk on Winston Churchill and on his last journey with de Gaulle, with most of the public, not necessarily with the VIPs, saluting Churchill as he went past from Waterloo. And if you don't know about the Battle of Waterloo, you have to read up on the Battle of Waterloo.